Good evening, and welcome. Tonight's story begins not in a kitchen, but beside a fire. It is a story about patience, instinct, and survival. The origin of something simple and essential: bread. Long before ovens, long before recipes, long before names for the days of the week, there was grain, there was ash, and there was the will to create something lasting. If tales like this bring you peace, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Dim your lights now, make yourself comfortable, and let the stillness carry you backward, far beyond the reach of memory, to a place where the first fire still burns. Somewhere on the edge of a valley, just before dawn, an ember glowed quietly in a blackened pit. Smoke clung low to the ground, blue and silent. Around it, scattered stones marked the place where warmth was kept alive through the night. A figure stirred, not from sleep, but from the stillness that came with waiting. The air was cool, but not cold. Dust rested on every surface. There were no houses, no fences, no paths, only open land and the signs of people who moved with the seasons. The woman reached for a pouch made from hide. Inside there was grain, tiny, wild seeds gathered one by one from the high grasses of the plain. They had been soaked in water, drained, then dried in the sun. She had done this many times before. She did not need to look. The grain was hard, bitter if eaten raw, but it held promise. That promise had been felt by many before her, though none had spoken it aloud. This morning, like many before, she would grind. 2 stones lay beside the fire, one large and flat, the other small and round. She poured the grain between them and began to press, slowly, firmly. A low scraping sound began to echo between the trees. The rhythm was familiar. So were the aches in her wrists. She paused, brushed away chaff with the back of her hand, then kept working. Over time, the grain turned to meal, not soft, not even, but enough. From a gourd she poured a small amount of water. She added it carefully, letting it soak into the ground meal. With her fingers, she stirred, pressed, folded. A sticky paste began to form. She added more water. Kneading began, not because she understood gluten or technique, but because her hands told her it was time. The paste thickened. A fly landed nearby and flew off. Ash drifted. She pulled a flat, blackened rock from the side of the fire. It had been heating since the stars were still visible. She brushed it off with a bundle of grass. No oil, no salt, only heat and habit. She tore a piece of the paste and flattened it with her palms. It hissed softly as it touched the stone. Steam rose. It smelled faintly of earth and smoke. She waited. Others had gathered nearby. They sat quietly. Bread-making was not a show. It was routine. A quiet exchange between heat and grain. A child played with a stick, dragging it in the dirt. The woman flipped the dough. The underside had blackened slightly. The edges curled upward. She pressed it again, gently. The second side cooked faster. When she lifted it off the stone, the center sagged. It was not soft, not crisp, but it was food. She let it cool, then tore it apart. Inside, it was dense, damp, uneven. A few grains had not broken down. She passed half to a man sitting beside her. He nodded, but did not speak. They chewed. It took time. More dough was ready. She flattened it and pressed it onto the rock again. The fire snapped softly. Smoke twisted upward. The scent of burnt flour mixed with morning air. This was not the first time she had made bread, nor would it be the last. But something about this morning felt heavier. The last rains had come early. The grain had been harder to find. They would need to move soon. This food, flat, dry, portable, would matter. It could travel. It could feed. It could stay good longer than fruit or meat. The man took the finished bread and wrapped it in a leaf. He placed it beside a stone blade and a bundle of dried roots. Their provisions were small, but growing. Further down the slope, another fire smoldered. A younger girl ground seeds with slow determination. She paused often. Her technique was not yet smooth, but she worked. She watched. She learned. In the trees, birds called to one another. Wind touched the tips of the tall grasses. Ash from the fire settled on the woman's knees. She brushed it away with the side of her hand. The act of making bread was older than her memory, older than the language she spoke. It came from observing the world, how seeds softened in water, how heat changed them, how hands could shape what once seemed inedible. There were no scrolls, no instructions, no tools beyond what the earth gave, but there was knowledge, passed not by words, but by watching, repeating, remembering. By mid-morning, 4 flatbreads lay wrapped and stacked. They would cool slowly. Their scent would fade, but their weight would remain. Nearby, a child coughed. The woman turned, handed her a piece of crust. It was dry. The child chewed without complaint. This was food. This was survival. Later that day, they would pack their tools, their dried roots, their stones. The fire would be buried, the ash scattered, but the method would remain. In another valley, another morning, the same hands, or hands like them, would begin again. Stones, grain, water, fire. That was how it began, not with instructions, but with repetition, not with flavor, but with need, not in a city, but beneath the open sky. This bread, rough, dense, charred, was the beginning of something permanent, a shift from gathering to making, from chance to choice. It was not soft, it was not sweet, but it fed, it lasted, it could be shared, it could be taught. And in that sharing, it became sacred, not because it was delicious, but because it endured. And in every quiet morning that followed, when a woman knelt by fire, when grain met heat, when a hand tore flatbread in half, the memory of the first bread lived on. Even if no one spoke it aloud, they came to the river not for water, but for what had drifted beside it. In the early morning hush, when mist hovered low and birds called from the reeds, the people gathered along the shallows. They carried baskets woven from wild grasses and eyes sharpened by hunger. The rains had washed more than mud down the slopes. Seeds had come too, shaken loose from dry stalks, swept into the currents, and left behind in soft eddies and patches of silt. Women bent low, fingers sifting through the wet earth, collecting each kernel they could find, some round, some long, some still in husks. Every grain was precious. In a world without storage, without fields or fences, every handful meant another day. Fire crackled at the edge of the grove. Old stone circles blackened by soot marked the places where generations had once cooked tubers and boiled bitter herbs. But today, something else would be tried. They had seen birds scratch at the earth for seeds. They had watched how fire changed the texture of bark, of roots, of anything it touched. The idea was not spoken aloud because there were no words for invention, only for necessity. A flat stone was cleaned and set over the embers, supported by other rocks. The heat began to rise, warming the surface slowly, evenly. From crushed nuts, a paste was made. From wild honeycomb, a smear of sweetness. But today, hands reached for the new thing, the seeds. A young man took 2 stones and ground the grains between them. It was slow. Each motion required effort, and the sound, grit against grit, seemed to echo across the clearing. Dust rose, not the smoke of fire, but something lighter, paler, powder from the heart of the seeds. Flour, though they did not yet call it so. A woman added a splash of water from a gourd. Her fingers mixed the paste, slow, deliberate, sticky, coarse, strange. She shaped it into a flat disk, barely thicker than a leaf. With a glance, she pressed it onto the hot stone. Sizzle, not like meat, not like herbs. A soft crackling as the moisture hissed and the surface browned. Eyes watched, nostrils flared. It smelled different, like earth and fire and memory. They waited. No one spoke. When she lifted it, the underside had darkened, not burned, cooked. She tore a piece and held it to her lips. Chewed. Her face held stillness, then the faintest tilt of her brow, not bitter, not sweet, just sustaining. The others came closer. Pieces were passed. Fingers broke off small bites. Some nodded, some stayed silent. But no one spat it out. That evening, more stones were gathered. Children carried dried twigs for kindling. Older hands ground more seeds. Over time, the flat stones were shaped better, their surfaces smoothed. The paste became thinner. Someone added salt from the riverbank. Another tried mashing dried berries into the dough. The taste shifted, deepened. Nothing was written down. Everything was remembered by repetition. The way the flour should feel between the fingers, the smell of it when the heat was just right, the sound it made when lifted at the right time. One day, they made too much. A disk of dough lay forgotten beside the fire. The next morning, it was firmer, sourer. Still they cooked it and found it lighter, with pockets of air. It made them feel full faster. The change was noticed, not understood, but welcomed. They left more dough overnight just to see. They began watching the skies. If clouds gathered, they collected seeds early. If dry winds blew, they built shelter for their stores. Slowly, the seed became not a gift of the river, but a thing they sought directly. They dug at hillsides, found more stalks, carried handfuls back to camp. Dug again next season, finding more in the same place. A pattern, a habit, the earliest form of cultivation. Fire had shaped them, stone had served them, now grain was guiding them. The bread changed too. Someone placed it not on stone, but beneath ashes. It cooked slower, softer. The crust darkened, but the center stayed moist. Another time, they left it too long. It burned black, cracked. But even that had a lesson. Timing. Time had entered the kitchen, though they had no clocks. They measured with shadows, with the length of songs, with the pace of footsteps, and through it all, the bread remained, flat, earthy, slightly sour, eaten warm or cold, shared at dusk, whispered over at dawn. Its making became ritual. Children learned the steps not from instruction, but from rhythm, grinding, mixing, shaping, cooking. The movements etched into muscle and memory. No one called it sacred, but all treated it with care. Even the ashes were saved, stirred into stews, spread on wounds. Ash, too, had power. One night, an elder placed hot bread on a stone and said it reminded him of the sun, round, warm, golden. The others laughed softly, but remembered. The next time they shaped it, they pressed lines into it, rays, marks, a symbol. Decoration had begun. The bread was no longer just food. It was memory, message, marker of time. A child was born, bread, a hunt successful, bread, a death mourned, bread. And every time it tasted slightly different. A touch of honey, a handful of crushed root, a bit of salt, or none at all. Bread became the story of the day, the flavor of the moment, the map of a season. The village grew around its making, stones arranged, fires tended, storage pits dug. The bread demanded space, attention, continuity. It tied people not only to fire and stone, but to each other. You could not make it alone, not anymore. And so, as seasons shifted and faces aged, the bread remained quiet, constant, warm in the hand and firm in the belly. The seed had offered itself, and fire had revealed its secret. All that was needed was patience. And they had learned to wait. The year was unrecorded, but the season was dry. A long summer had stretched across the land, parching the hills, flattening the colors of the meadows into ochres and browns. Water became sacred, and grain sacred still. In a valley near a sluggish river, a settlement of early humans had begun to shape their lives around routine, necessity, and ritual. The fires were now not just for warmth or warding off predators, they were a tool of change. For weeks, they had been perfecting their grain cakes. Crushed wild barley and emmer, soaked in water, patted into discs, and placed on hot stones. The results were often bitter, crumbly, sometimes burnt. But each failure taught them something new. One morning, a woman noticed that damp ash from a burned-out fire seemed to preserve warmth longer than exposed stone. She gathered embers, flattened a round of grain paste between two leaves, and tucked it into the ash. It hissed slightly, and the smell was unlike before, nutty, earthy, and faintly sweet. When she retrieved it, the edges were firm and crisp. The center steamed. She broke it apart, tasted it, and called others over. That evening, the meal was different. Not simply survival, but improvement. They talked as they ate. For the first time, the bread did not taste of haste or necessity, but of intention. That change rippled. Every fire pit became an oven. They began collecting stones that held heat longer, arranging them in circles, raising them higher to trap the warmth. Soon, they were building small windshields of woven reeds packed with mud. The architecture of bread had begun. Nearby, a man experimented with sprouted grains. He noticed that soaking the seeds for days gave a sweeter taste when mashed. These cakes, once dried and roasted, gave energy for longer. The people called this new bread life seed in their tongue. They began burying small bundles of it with their dead. A recognition had formed. This food was not just for body, but for memory. Children watched and learned. They helped grind with stones, mimicking the rhythmic push and pull. Their hands grew strong, their backs bent early. The act of making bread became their initiation. Elders told stories while mixing the dough. Bread was now tied to origin myths, that the first woman was made of grain and wind, and her heart was a hot stone. One dusk, lightning struck a dry tree near their store of crushed seeds. The fire leapt fast, furious. The tribe scrambled, but most of the stored grain turned black. Mourning lasted days, but someone, perhaps in hunger, picked a blackened clump from the edge and bit into it. The bitterness was deep, but underneath, an unexpected taste, smoky, rich. From ruin they had found roasting. They began charring the outsides of cakes before burying them in ash. The flavor deepened. So too did their reverence for fire. From that moment, flames were no longer wild. They were sacred. The best bakers were given honored spots by the fire. They sang as they cooked. Songs of smoke, stone, and grain. Days grew shorter, and the air sharpened. With winter crawling near, they had to preserve what they could. Bread became thinner, dried longer, stored in leather pouches high above the ground. They learned to travel with it. Now, food could go with the hunters. It fed them days from home. One man began wrapping the dough in animal stomach lining before baking in ash. It stayed moist longer. Innovations like this were rare and celebrated. The tribe began marking seasons by the bread they made. Spring for sprouted loaves, summer for flat cakes, winter for dried wheels. Bread had become calendar, memory, and offering. Across the hills, another group wandered into their valley. At first, tensions rose, but when a woman offered a slice of her smoky barley cake to a stranger, he accepted. The two groups sat, shared, exchanged not just bread, but method. They showed how they used river reeds to strain finer flour. In return, the strangers taught how to crush acorns and leach their bitterness. New ingredients meant new shapes, tastes, stories. Children were born from this mingling. Their names carried the words for ash, stone, and seed. One of them would grow to place flat stones over flame and build the first true oven. But that was still years ahead. For now, they gathered each evening near the cooking pits, letting the scent of baking bread rise into the sky, a signal to the stars that they were still here. They ate slowly, with hands in silence. When the bread cracked between teeth, it was more than a sound. It was memory, work, wisdom passed in every bite. A girl once dropped her dough into the river by mistake. Hours later, it was found stuck against a reed, fermented and bubbling. They laughed, but tried baking it anyway. The sourness surprised them. Some disliked it, others grew fond. From that accident, sourdough was born. Accidents became teachers. A boy left his grain mash too long, and insects swarmed. They avoided it, but he noticed the smell had changed. When he cooked it, the taste was wild and strange. Not every idea survived, but each was a stone on the path. As years passed, their bread grew in layers, cracked crusts, soft cores, smoky rims. No two loaves were ever the same. Recipes did not exist. Memory and instinct guided their hands. Grain was ground coarsely, then fine, sometimes mixed with honey, sometimes with crushed roots. They used whatever was near. Bread adapted. When the river flooded, they baked on higher ground. When the stones cracked, they used bark. Each hardship made the bread more resilient. When the first true child was born under moonlight and fed warm ash bread from her mother's hand, the tribe wept, not from hunger or joy, but because the act itself had become sacred. The bread was no longer survival. It was story. Every grain crushed, every cake turned to ash, was a retelling of the days they dared to wait for the dough to rise, and each time they baked, they remembered. The rhythm of days in the ancient settlement was marked by simple repetitions. Grind, knead, bake, share. But this rhythm was not mechanical. It was ritual, almost sacred. In the dust-colored courtyard beneath a sloping hide roof, the fourth son of the week cast long amber shadows across baskets of wheat and bowls of gritty flour. A young woman squatted low beside a stone slab, her hands firm and experienced despite her age. The slab had been smoothed by countless hours of grinding, the sandstone surface made almost soft by years of touch. Grain after grain, the wheat berries crushed into meal under her polished stone roller, releasing a faintly sweet, grassy scent. Her fingers worked automatically, moving with confidence, but her mind drifted toward memory of times when this process was not so known, when fire had not yet become friend and bread was still only a fragile idea. The woman's mother appeared beside her, silent but heavy in presence. She carried a bowl of charred embers and warm ash. In those early days, fire was as unpredictable as weather. It could vanish in the night or lash out with fury and consume huts, baskets, people. But here, fire had been tamed somewhat. It now served a purpose beyond light and heat. It became a partner in creation. The ash was not waste. It was proof of endurance, the slow memory of trees that once stood tall. She sifted it between her fingers, feeling its texture, dry, fine, with flecks of wood still half formed. When scattered into the earth oven pit, it insulated the stone base, held the warmth longer, baked the dough more evenly. But even more curiously, it gave the bread a scent, smoky, earthy, strangely comforting. The two women worked silently, and nearby a child watched. His legs were folded, chin resting on knees. He had never known a time before bread. For him, it was as natural as breathing. But in the stories passed down, he heard that this was not always so. There were times when meals meant raw tubers, bitter leaves, the cracked marrow of bones. Bread had been a triumph, not of flavor, but of patience. The dough that day was simple: stone-ground wheat, tepid water from the morning fire, a pinch of salt harvested from the nearby marshes. Yet, even simple things carried deep meaning. The dough, thick and elastic, was turned and pressed, not with violence, but intention. The older woman, with lines etched deep into her face like riverbeds, murmured to it as she shaped the round loaves. Not words exactly, sounds, prayers perhaps, or memories, maybe both. Beside the baking pit, stones glowed with heat. The smell rising from them was primal: char, steam, and the slightly sour tang of fermenting dough. They did not know the term yeast, but they knew that if the dough sat long enough, it changed. It breathed. It grew light. Sometimes it collapsed. Sometimes it rose like a miracle. And on rare days, it formed pockets inside the bread, bubbles of air, softness, a sign that something invisible had visited and blessed their work. They placed the loaves carefully onto hot stones, then buried them with ash and heated clay lids. It would take time. Time was the main ingredient in their food, not herbs, not exotic fats. Time. Every meal was a collaboration between patience and heat. The child grew bored and wandered, but the women remained, eyes fixed on the ground as if reading omens in the cracks of clay. In the afternoon, the first loaf was unearthed. Its bottom crust had blackened where ash met dough, but the middle had turned golden. When they tapped it, it made a hollow sound, a knock from the inside of history. The smell was stronger now: roasted grain, wood smoke, life. They broke it open while it still steamed. No knives, no ceremony, just fingers and hunger. The child returned, drawn by scent alone. He took a piece and bit. His mouth burned slightly, but he said nothing. The texture was rougher than what would come in future centuries. There was no butter, no oil, just warmth and effort. But he chewed with eyes wide. Elsewhere in the village, the scent drifted. Others emerged, elders, hunters, the sick, the slow. Bread was never just for one. It was always made for many. The baking pit became a quiet gathering place, not for speech, but for nourishment. People dipped the bread in broth, used it to scoop fermented beans, or ate it alone, letting the rough crust scratch their teeth. As night fell, the women cleaned the pit. They placed the remaining ash in a pot to dry. Nothing was wasted. Even the discarded crusts were crumbled and stored, mixed with ground seeds to make porridge for infants. Bread, once made, extended its life in every direction. It became paste, meal, fodder. It lingered beyond its baking. A distant elder, seated near the fire, spoke softly to a younger man. He told her the first time they'd tried this, how the grain had burned, how the dough stuck to stones, how stomachs turned from sour ash, how eventually someone learned to wait, to listen to the sound of baking, to smell not just smoke, but readiness. Bread taught them more than how to eat. It taught them how to time their days, how to trust the fire, how to test without fear, and how to feed others before feeding oneself. In its round shape, elders saw the sun. In its cracks, they saw the riverbeds. In its crust, they saw resilience. That night, the same child who had eaten first watched the moonrise. Crumbs still clung to his lips. He didn't know why the bread mattered, only that it did, that it arrived warm and filled something deeper than hunger. He lay down near the embers, listening to the occasional crack of cooling stone. Behind him, the older woman hummed again, not a song, but a vibration, a sound that said, "We were here, we waited, we learned." And in the background, rising with the steam of the last loaf, was the quiet, invisible spirit of all that had come before. The days stretched into weeks, and the patterns of life flowed with the steadiness of the river. You watched the people return to the place where fire and grain had first come together, not just for hunger, but for memory, for ritual, for connection. Each time the dough was placed beneath the ash or pressed against the warm stones, it was as if the village was reaching out through the veil of time, speaking to the ancestors, honoring something larger than themselves. By now, the process was no longer a curiosity. It had become a rhythm, the soaking of the grain, the slow drying under the sun, the grinding with stones that carried stories of their own. Children, once wild with play, now gathered around the flat rocks, imitating the motions of their elders, the scraping, the kneading, the dust that clung to their fingers. These were gestures passed not through speech, but through time, silent, persistent, essential. The bread was no longer just a meal. It had become something to be shared during naming rites, during the birth of a new season, during the return of the herds. There was a kind of reverence in how it was handled. Cracks in the surface of a baked round spoke of stories in the fire, of wood chosen carefully, of heat measured not by tools, but by instinct. The ash that once marked only the end of fire now bore sacred significance. It was the keeper of warmth, the protector of sustenance, the echo of beginnings. You sat quietly beside one of the women who had first shaped this discovery. Her hands, cracked from years of stone and grain, moved with no hesitation. She did not look down as she worked. She did not measure, did not count. Her fingers knew Her back knew. Her breathing matched the pulse of the task. In her silence, there was a world of knowledge. You watched, not daring to interrupt. In the space between her motions, the past lived again. Nearby, an older man prepared the fire. His eyes were clouded, his steps slow, but his hands found the right branches, the dry moss, the stones that held heat longer. He had been among the first to taste the bread made from mistake. Now he lit the flame with a purpose that went beyond warmth. It was a ritual, a tribute, a remembering. His grandchildren sat nearby, hushed for once, their eyes wide. They too understood that something old and invisible moved between them. The smell rose once more, not just smoke, not just grain. It was deeper, earthy, clean, a scent that quieted the heart. It mingled with the whispering wind, with the distant sounds of animals, with the gentle rustle of leaves. The land, it seemed, approved. It had seen the fire before. It had felt the same weight of feet, the same dreams rising like heat. You looked up, and for a moment the world seemed very still. Then came the sharing, a circle, a gesture, a piece broken off and passed by hand, not voice. The first bite, all was slow, eyes closing, the warmth spreading. No matter how many times it had been made, the feeling was the same. Gratitude for the earth, for the hands, for the fire, for the patience it all demanded. And there, in that space between bites, stories were told, quiet ones, about the days when hunger pushed them to crush dry seeds, about the laughter when ash had first dusted the dough, about the surprise at how satisfying it had been, about the silence that followed, the silence of recognition, of knowing something old had returned, or perhaps had never left. A small child spoke aloud, asking if the first bread had always tasted like this. No one answered directly. Instead, the woman tore off another piece and placed it in his hand. "Taste and remember," she whispered. And in that moment, the child joined the lineage, not through blood, but through bread, through participation, through care. At the edge of the circle, someone added herbs to the next mix. Fragrant wild things gathered at dawn. Their presence changed the aroma slightly, made it brighter, livelier. The group murmured, nodding at the new notes in the air. Nothing was fixed. Everything could grow, could evolve, but never too fast. The bread taught patience. It insisted on it. You thought of those who had left, the ones who had wandered far in search of better land or more water. They would carry this memory too, the rhythm of grinding, the glow of embers, the feel of warm grain between fingers. In time, others would learn from them. In caves and valleys, on hilltops far from here, the process would repeat, perhaps with different grains, perhaps under different stars, but always with the same wisdom beneath it all. Later, as night fell, the fire was allowed to die slowly. No one rushed to cover the embers. The woman placed a stone near the coals, just close enough to capture their heat for the morning. A child leaned his head on his mother's shoulder. A man wrapped a warm piece of flat bread in cloth and tucked it away, not for himself, but for an elder who had fallen ill and could not attend. There was no ceremony, no declaration, just the steady, quiet movement of people who understood that something sacred did not need to be shouted. It was in the hands, in the care, in the waiting. You sat a while longer, watching the last wisps of smoke curl into the dark sky. Stars began to appear, one by one, the same stars that had shone on the first fire. The same stars that would light future ovens, future bakers, future gatherings. The sky held the memory too, and in the distance, faint but clear, came the sound of someone beginning again, grinding, scraping, preparing. The cycle had no end. The story had found its voice, not in words, but in repetition. It would be told again tomorrow, and the next day, and as long as hands remembered how to shape dough, and hearts remembered why it mattered. Hey, said the fire had to be patient too. The ancient ones didn't rush it. You see it now, crouched low, licking around stones blackened by the memories of 1,000 meals. Its warmth wraps around you, not as heat, but as the heartbeat of time. You hear it crackle softly, like a voice that's told this story too many times and no longer needs to shout. The bread would not be shaped by urgency. It would be shaped by smoke, waiting, and the wisdom of repetition. The woman beside the fire, her hands wrinkled by sun and smoke, moves slowly. Her palms roll a soft, coarse dough between them, then gently flatten it, not more than a finger's breadth thick. There is no table, no oven, no tools beyond stone and skin and muscle memory, just earth and ash, and time bending gently forward. She reaches to the edge of the embers, where white ash lies like fresh snow. A flat stone has been warming there, embedded in coals. With a stick, she scrapes it clean of ash, her motions precise, practiced. She sets the dough upon it, watches without blinking. The fire doesn't leap. It breathes, and in that breath, the transformation begins. There is a smell, not sweet, not burnt, something older, the mingling of wild barley and fire-kissed air. It reaches you softly, as though carried down through generations. You can almost hear the whisper of those who once stood here, thousands of years ago, baking for the first time, not because they were hungry, but because they could. Another woman kneels nearby, younger, mimicking the motions, learning by watching, not asking. The older woman does not speak. She doesn't need to. Her hands say enough. Fold, pat, lay, wait. In the distance, a child's voice calls, muffled by trees and wind, but no one looks up. The bread is not ready. You hear the gentle hiss as moisture from the dough hits the warm stone, the shift of crust beginning to form. The edge lifts, blisters, darkens. One turn with a sharp stick, one check. No clocks, no timers, just eyes trained on firelight and instinct. One side darkens faster than the other. A gust of wind nudges the coals. The old woman moves a stone, shades the flame with her body, adjusts the world slightly to preserve the bread's stillness. There's something holy in the silence. You feel it as you breathe. Grain crushed by stone, fire born from splinters, patience kneaded into every moment. This isn't baking. This is remembering. When she lifts the flatbread with fingers calloused and unafraid of heat, the smell deepens. Char, grain, ash, not burnt, seasoned by flame. She taps it once against the stone. A soft thud, not hollow, not dense, just right. She tears it in half, steam curling upward. She offers a piece to the younger woman, who breaks it again, offering part to you. You accept it. It's still hot. Your fingers catch bits of ash. It sticks to your skin. You don't wipe it off. You bite. It's not soft. It's not crispy. It's both. There's no salt, no yeast, no oil, just memory and texture. It tastes like smoke and dry grass and the sweat of hands that built shelter, ground flour, waited for the sun to rise. It tastes like effort, quiet, and survival. They eat slowly, chewing with thought. No rush, no talk. The act itself is enough. As you watch, more dough is brought forward. This time it's different, mixed with crushed seeds, maybe wild onion, or some herb dried by the heat of yesterday's stone. The fire welcomes it too, crackling just a little louder as the second batch is laid down. The young woman tries the motion, cleaning the stone, laying the dough, but she's too fast. The edge tears. She pauses, looks at the elder, who gives only a look. No scolding, just the firelight flickering across her face and the lesson resting in stillness. They wait again. The sun has tilted now, the shadows stretching long. Somewhere nearby, you hear water, the slow trickle of a stream. This fire was lit with that water's help, and the grain that grew beside it. You understand now why bread and water are the center of so many prayers, why they became offerings, why they outlasted kings. You glance around. No one owns this bread. It isn't sold. It isn't hoarded. It's shared like a secret told without words. And the ashes it leaves behind, they aren't waste. They'll be gathered, cooled, and rubbed on skin to keep insects away, or stirred into clay to seal the cooking pots. Even the burn is used. As twilight deepens, a final round of dough is placed on the stone. Thinner now, a treat perhaps. You see someone sprinkle dried berries onto it before folding it once, then twice. The smell that rises now is slightly sweet, slightly wild. Your stomach stirs again. They don't eat this one yet. They wrap it in leaves and tuck it aside, maybe for tomorrow, maybe for someone else, maybe for the gods. This moment, though, this quiet gathering around a fire where dough becomes sustenance, it feels sacred. You sit, the embers warming your feet, the fading light soft on your face. You are not just witnessing the making of bread, you are part of it. The fire dims, the last pieces are lifted, a few coals are nudged to one side, the rest allowed to die with dignity. The old woman places a stone over them, not to hide, but to honor. And you think, how many fires, how many loaves, how many hands came before? The bread may be gone, but the way remains. Simple, patient, unbroken. And so, with a bit of ash on your thumb and the scent of smoke in your clothes, you sit quietly, letting the night hold you. You've eaten something ancient,